Aloha and welcome back to the Of Common Clay podcast. This is Dane, and today I have something a little different for you than our first handful of episodes, which were each one-on-one conversations between Lauren and I. A couple of days ago, I had the pleasure of sitting down with Nicole Gi, who is running for Congress out of Hawaii's 2nd District. The primary is coming up on August 13th, which is why we wanted to go ahead and put this episode out right away. I actually reached out to Nicole to have an interview with her for a documentary series that I've talked a little bit about already on the podcast, and we'll talk about more as it gets closer, but I'm finally bringing that project into sharper focus, and the first couple of episodes will hopefully be out in the next few months by the end of the year. And so this interview will be part of that project, which will also be an ongoing series like this podcast in order to have conversations about health in a slightly more cinematic documentary format. And this podcast is meant to be much more conversational. And we also will be exploring some other ways of playing with the podcast format and storytelling and mythology and our love for music and sound and cinema into future episodes as well. Can't wait to share all of that with you, but without further ado, I'm really excited for you all to get to know Nicole a little bit better. She brings a lot of fresh ideas to the table, I think, and I really like her perspective. And so I'll go ahead and let her introduce herself, and then you can catch our full hour or so long conversation thereafter. Thanks so much again for being here. Aloha.
I'm Nicole Gi, and I'm running for Congress in the U.S. House of Representatives CD2, and that encompasses small town Oahu, including Kailua, as well as all of the other islands. And I'm running because I'm really tired of the leadership of both the Democratic and Republican parties telling us that we have no choice but to bomb a bunch of countries, to subsidize corporate monopolies, to subsidize polluters, to force people out of their jobs because they're not willing to take a shot, to close down local businesses, to censor everyone who disagrees with them. And yet at the same time, they can move at the speed of light to do things that aren't really for the people. And I decided to run to try to be a voice to counter that, because I know there are many of us who know that's not true, and we have to do whatever we can to fight back that narrative.
All right, cool. Welcome. Thank you for being here. I'd like to start by, even though we've already had a brief chat about the project and all that, I'll just kind of give you a little quick bio of myself, since at this point I probably know a little more about you than you do me. And then we'll just kind of go from there, and I'll throw in some questions as I go along the way. I think I already told you I was born here in Kailua and spent the first 18 years of my life here in Kailua playing sports and studying film in my own ways along the way. And when I was 18, I really decided I was passionate about filmmaking and storytelling, and kind of broke away from competitive sports at that point in my life and really focused on the arts. Went to film school in Chicago, and my passion was fiction films for the longest time, but I always had a desire to tell documentaries and stories about cultural and political and especially environmental things, and so those were always just lingering in the back of my mind. And then I spent a long time in LA and then moved back home to Hawaii in 2018 and was set out to make a movie about climate change. And so that became the impetus for this project. And recently I came across you on Instagram, and as we're in this current political season, saw your run for Congress. So if you could speak a little bit to, and go as long or short as you feel compelled to, but just kind of a little intro to where you come from, your journey to this decision right now. And what especially caught my attention and kind of hooked me right away was the simplicity of your Instagram profile, but it was something like, or I'm going to paraphrase, but no war, no oil, and no mandates, or something to that effect. You can maybe say exactly what it is better, but
that's just about right. It was end the wars, end pollution, and the mandates. So
cool.
I'm glad it was memorable.
Yeah. Maybe just a little bit of, about your childhood, as much as you want to get into growing up on Kauai, and like what led you to want to study science in college, and maybe a little bit about your initial political aspirations, and then how you got to this moment right here.
Great. So, like you said, I grew up on Kauai, and in terms of what I wanted to do when I was a kid, it was actually all over the place. My first thing I wanted to do was actually be a writer, and I kind of think kind of similarly to you, integrate kind of like political environmental messaging and that sort of thing. And I don't actually know where my interest in the environment originally started. I was one of those kids though who, like I went to every classroom and took all of the aluminum cans out of the trash and went to the recycling. I think maybe that just comes from my mom's side of the family is very big on not wasting anything, and I was lucky on Kauai to get to go on a lot of field trips about conservation, and so maybe that was the initial impetus. And I was a pretty different person, I think, as a kid. I was very much a people pleaser, a don't rock the boat kind of person. I just wanted everyone to be happy. People always called me like a little hippie. And I decided to, so I left Kauai after Kauai High School graduation to attend Stanford, and decided I wanted to go into environmental engineering specifically because, and honestly, this was what 18-year-old me was thinking, hey, I'm good at math, I should go into engineering if I want to help the environment. And that seems like something that I could contribute meaningfully. But during my time there, I decided that I still wanted to be involved in more of kind of the social movement, the more people interactions related stuff. So my first internship, even though I was doing environmental engineering, was actually at the state capitol in California. I was interning for a advocacy group, the Planning and Conservation League. I think they changed their name actually recently. And it was a really interesting experience, because for me, I'd always heard about corporate money and influence and that sort of thing in politics, but what really got me was how much of it was just personalities too. People not getting over their egos and creating these different allyships and enemies that even if they totally agreed on something, they just wouldn't pass it through. It was nuts. I was there the year that Arnold Schwarzenegger vetoed a solar bill because somebody had called him a name. And the bill actually, he spelled out, I probably can't swear on this. The bill spelled out "fuck you" in the first letters of it. This is the kind of thing I was dealing with, and I told myself, okay, I am never getting involved in politics. Like, I'm just so sick of all these people. I'm gonna go back to like focusing in my little science corner. And so that's what I did for about a decade. I worked in the environmental field specifically on pollution issues. For me, I have a tendency to gravitate towards the underdog, and at Stanford, everything was pretty technocratic. People wanted to go into renewable energy. But for me, in my education, what I had learned, and what I'm so surprised about when I, talk to a lot of people about the environment, is pollution and the degeneration of our soil are just as imminent threats as climate change, and of course they're connected. But it's interesting that people gravitate towards, I think, just focusing on one thing in a lot of movements that often tend to be the most controversial part of the movement. I think I think most people believe in pollution, and a lot of the same solutions to climate change relate to pollution. So for me, that's why I decided to really focus on, reducing environmental toxins like plastic and different chemicals, especially from pesticides and herbicides. I feel like I'm rambling a lot here, and I'm trying to remember what the
Yeah,
original...
no, I think it's all great. It's all great. No, that feeds into, I think we have a lot of overlap in just the journeys through things, somehow along the way, the Democratic Party and whatever it means to be on the left in America became this party of science, and in a way that I kind of became also, that became an identity that I held as somebody who wanted to defend science and defend the story of climate change and global warming. But I think as I've really worked on this particular project and talked to more people and read more, it's the synchronicity and the just all seems to come back to similar things, and they are that we're poisoning our environment, and we get caught up in conversations about whether storms are more powerful or not, and trading dollars for CO2 emissions, which is an extension of just arguing about things within the context of the system that is already polluting and harming the environment. And so it becomes this abstraction. So I'm wondering if, especially as somebody who studied science in college, because certainly during COVID, I've had many people tell me, as somebody who did not study science in college, that I have no basis for talking about science. But yet, these are the same people who are willing to, who don't necessarily have degrees in climate sciences, are totally mad at Republicans for denying climate change, and it just seems like we miss the overall conversation, and ultimately we're all talking about the same things, though. Sorry, that was a kind of long-winded, non-specific question, but I guess my question for you is, what do you see as a solution to these divide and conquer ways, and how can we kind of narrow the conversation back to actually talking about the wars and the poisons and the toxins and the things that are direct effects on the health of the planet and on us?
For sure. And I guess taking a step back to your earlier question about why I decided to run, I volunteered for a lot of different campaigns, including congressional campaigns that I would call for progressive candidates. And I think it's really easy to end up getting in the weeds and into those little fights and lose sight of the big picture. And I think that gets especially hard with science. And I think for me, it's interesting because I think the takeaway for me was how little we actually know, and to just have some humility about the fact that science always evolves and that we all only know what we've been taught, right? And I think some other people in the science field, and there's different cultures at different schools, right? And I am pleasantly surprised that I don't think I'm that smart. I definitely had a lot of classmates who I think are absolutely certainly they understand everything. But when did we decide Pluto wasn't a planet? That was a few years ago. I can't remember the exact statistic, but I think for pharmaceutical projects, statistically, we find out about or it comes to light publicly, the long-term side effects. It takes at least 5 years, right? We barely understand the human body. There's all these things that I think intuitively we know, but I think there's some human nature that seeks understanding and control, and it helps to be able to follow a set of guidelines, which science isn't supposed to be, right? It's supposed to be constant experimentation, but I think especially in times of fear like COVID, people just want to be told what to do a lot of the time. And they don't, even for me, right? I'm not a doctor, I don't have medical training, but I do have a skepticism from, constantly hearing our captured regulatory bodies, including the EPA, claim that things are totally safe. Look at glyphosate and Roundup, right? And, reality catches up. People are getting cancer, people are putting the dots together. And for me, I didn't see a reason that medical science was any less subject to corporate influence and regulatory capture than the EPA or any other organization. There's no monolith there. But it does, that's not really addressing the question of why so many people do that. These are just kind of my own feelings from my colleagues and people I went to school with about kind of what some of those tendencies are.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, I think, okay, if maybe I want to get a little more into science and the COVID and that, but I'd like to jump back just in my own story a little bit. Before I moved back here to work on the documentary, I was working on a fiction series that took place in Detroit. And there were a lot of stories about Detroit, but also about just many urban cities in America going through this big sort of transformation in the 2010s, losing people to suburbs and just going through, ramifications from the 2008-2009 recession that is still a recession basically, and yet doesn't get talked about. So I was writing a fiction story kind of about social movements and about building community to be more resilient. And a lot of people are doing urban farming and things like that in many cities, but it's big in Detroit. And so that kind of leveraged into this project too. But one of the central things that became important to that was what is known as gift economics. And also I had this idea of them developing a local currency, which I found as one of your main kind of website talking points. So I'm wondering if there's anything you'd like to share just about that idea and concept and where that comes from in your background and thinking, and just anything you want to share more about politically or otherwise, what that's about.
Sure. I think my overarching political philosophy is that decentralizing and localizing power tends to be one of the best ways to empower people and limit corruption. And I think, I could talk about the Federal Reserve Bank all day, but for me, I think a lot of the controls we've seen during COVID and otherwise on people tend to be financial, right? And so on that end, I think local currencies are a valuable way to help increase local autonomy in general. I think there's other benefits that speak to a lot more people who are, deep into monetary policy and that sort of thing, which is just the ability to incentivize contributions to society and supporting local businesses in a way that can be challenging, without some sort of quote monetary incentive. And, I don't even remember how I originally had heard about local currencies, honestly. I look at a lot of alternative media, but I think it's such a great way. For example, if a local government wanted to pay people to plant trees or something, you could pay someone out in a local currency, even if you don't have federal funding that Hawaii is so dependent on right now. And then be able to make sure that money actually stays here in a tangible way. So that's why I'm really excited about it. I think also I appreciate that Hawaii has always, I think, had a culture of supporting small businesses more than a lot of other places, and so I think local currencies could resonate more here.
Yeah, I think a lot of people would, if I think what's missing in our socio-political conversations is just nuance back and forth like this about ideas and creative solutions to things we all kind of agree are problematic. And I think both parties that are paying attention to our political moment tend to agree that there's this outsourcing of power to this Federal Reserve, and beyond that, the World Economic Forum, and you name it. In 2016, I became a big Bernie Sanders supporter, and but also I've always felt like still kind of outside and beyond his place of radicalism, and so but I became reinvigorated with electoral politics in a way that I had kind of become disillusioned by in the previous handful of years or so, and now we're in this COVID moment where we see, we'll take try that one again. So I became even though Bernie was outside the system, I became reinstituted into our political divide in a way, being against the Trump side and being for the progressive policies and whatnot.
This is a good segue too, because I feel like I didn't actually answer your question about why I was running, and I think I can answer it on this.
Oh yeah, so I guess I'll just leave this more open-ended. If anything you'd be willing to share about your political evolution as an adult, especially voting history or otherwise, and party affiliation, and then anything you want to bring into how you've changed how you see your identity in that during COVID, if any.
Sure, and to your point, so Bernie changed my mind on a lot of things too, and got me involved in politics. And I think the biggest thing for me actually in 2016 is that I really saw the value of running even if you lose. And I had volunteered for a lot of campaigns that were very focused on winning, but Bernie, for me personally and for a lot of people I know, had such a big impact in his ability to make so many people stop and question, what they had been told. At least for me too, I just assumed, I'm just a fringe person, like nobody else agrees with me that we should be cutting the military budget in half, and he legitimized those positions in a way that I hadn't seen a candidate in my lifetime do before. And, to your point too, I didn't agree with Bernie on everything. And I think ironically, I did actually see him as a decentralization candidate because he was proposing such a large cut to the military, even though a lot of his other proposals would be considered big government. On the big hand, I think that the military-industrial complex, which I think we share a concern for, was very important, and he was the candidate who was supporting seeing that power get decentralized and minimized. So for me, I think that was part of my reason for getting involved in electoral politics again, too. And I've changed my mind on many issues over the years, and I think he helped keep me open-minded. That was a good thing too, because so many issues just weren't even on my radar, frankly, because I dismissed them as not even possible as changing in this country. And so after seeing candidates that I volunteered for after that just forget that, I think it really disappointed me, especially those who were elected to office, even though they had no corporate money. I honestly wondered, does the CIA hold you at gunpoint after you're elected and just tell you, like, you just have to fall in line? Like, what is going on? And I think,
love that you say that.
like, I think after volunteering for the candidates, and seeing, it's so interesting to see what's in the media versus actually talking to that candidate. You get a lot of the people who volunteer for campaigns, I don't know why, but disproportionately I think are very much the mentality of, like, do whatever it takes to win and compromise there. And if you are already doing that during your campaign, if that is your mindset, that's just what's going to happen once you're in office. Because there's never a line. You're always going to worry that, I'm sacrificing my future clout in 20 years by making this one comment that might offend some people. And so, and I think even in 2020, Bernie forgot that too. So I felt personally betrayed, honestly, by a lot of these candidates. And I felt like, I'm not perfect. I could fall victim to all these pressures too. But at least I want to try, because I do agree with a lot of folks, like Jimmy Dore and such, who say, it's important not to just totally rely on one political person as your hero. But I feel like we need to at least have some people try, and not to be a hero, but to just show, there are other people out there who don't think you're crazy, who actually think that change is possible. Congress moves at the speed of light when it's to bail out Wall Street or shut down the whole economy. They can get stuff done. And if there are at least some people who are willing to still believe that change is possible, I think that's worth it, whether or not you win a campaign or not.
Love that. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I see a lot of parallels with, what the way people argue the COVID dominant story is. Why would so many people that are in the field say it's true and go along with it? The same thing, I think, ends up happening sort of to people that hold political office, and it's really attached to livelihood. I think at the end of the day is what COVID has really kind of focused my, we can't blame people and expect them to hear our side for sure, is like, we can't have that mentality, but we really, I think, have to examine the monetary aspects of and the way we kind of outsource where we get our wealth from. And because there's so much money in politics, even if you're raising single dollar, like, contributions and not taking big donors, whether it's, once you get in the CIA, and that certainly wouldn't be beyond the realm of possibilities in this country at all, which is sad but true. But also it's just, you make your living that way now, and there's a lot of money in that world, no matter if you're successful. And so I think it makes it hard for people to question then their own role in the system, which I think has become very clear during COVID as the mandates have happened. And I started asking a lot of questions early on in the pandemic. I reached out to the Hawaii DOH and started doing this project from an investigative journalism perspective. And I actually interviewed Josh Green and Sarah Kemble last year. I haven't released anything from their interviews yet, because what I realized in examining this whole back and forth is that, it's going to take more time to tell this story, especially if you really want to move people. And really, ultimately, what all these things need to be is just ongoing conversations over time. So with that in mind, I'm wondering, when COVID began, if you could tell a little bit about where you were at with it, what your history is with health and the healthcare system. And for me, I was raised sort of completely outside of Western medicine, so I had this bias in this way coming in of not being in that realm. Is the light okay? Sorry.
Oh, I can move. I just felt it, actually.
It's pretty, yeah. So where were we? A little bit, if you share as much as of your own personal kind of upbringing on health and why maybe you are skeptical of the dominant COVID-19 story. As I kind of already said, I was raised kind of completely outside of Western medicine. I was born at home and never had never had a primary care physician at all. My parents had kind of just moved outside of that system shortly before I was born themselves, and just were fully in the natural health world. Anyway, if you could share just a little bit of your own story on health philosophy and anything else you want to share personally that kind of may be related, and then how that changed during COVID and what you thought of at the beginning of COVID.
Sure. So actually, I honestly hadn't paid that much attention to medicine or health. I was raised in a pretty traditional healthcare situation, and for me, I'll say that for the flu vaccine, I always had a really negative response to it, and I had stopped taking it. And I also just generally sometimes have negative reactions to surprising things. So I had that going for me, but I actually had grown up pretty Western medicine heavy. I also, though, had negative experiences with the doctors. When I was in college, my doctor actually refused to give me an IUD because she told me I was too young to have an IUD, which was just an absolutely bizarre experience. And so I did have, I knew doctors weren't perfect at that point. In the beginning of COVID, I was actually super freaked out. I was double masking. I was staying home. I was not doing anything. And, it's funny what different things change different people's minds, right? I have been in environmental pollution for a long time, but I never really made the connection to Western medicine. It's not something I looked into. And I actually, by chance, watched the movie Dallas Buyers Club.
You've tested positive for HIV, which is the virus that causes AIDS.
You fucking kidding me?
Total chance. And I did not know anything about the AIDS epidemic before that. I was born in 1990. It was, a little past my time for that, the height of that. And I had to look up afterwards whether the stuff in that movie was true about, everyone falling in line and supporting AZT, and it actually turned out that AZT at that dose was killing people, and that the FDA, including Fauci, was refusing to give people alternative medications. And that is when it finally clicked for me, actually. And this was I think late 2020 that I happened to see it. And I thought, wow, I I just kind of followed whatever the public health experts say. And why haven't I made that connection as someone who has spent years of my life fighting back against all of these assumptions about what are safe chemicals, and people making fun of me for saying that plastic was poisoning us, when now, it's commonplace. Oh, it's in our lungs, it's in our bloodstreams. Now everyone realizes that that's true. So that was it for me. And then I went down the rabbit hole, as I think many people did over the last few years, just like researching all this, like trying to understand what mRNA is, and actually reading the entirety of the Pfizer trials, because I had experience reading clinical trials in the chemical exposure background. And just for me, having experienced science reporting being inaccurate in there, I figured I might as well just read the whole thing. And it was just bananas to me, because I'm reading this trial and they explicitly say, we didn't test transmission, there was no all-cause mortality. That's kind of lingo. There wasn't a comparison of the total number of deaths, right, between the placebo group, and the group that actually got it. I personally knew people who were in the trial who told me alarming things that I didn't read in the reports that were publicly available. And I thought, you know what? I'm just not gonna take this chance. Like, when is the last time I've seen? We just had the opioid crisis, and you're gonna tell me that I'm gonna believe this? And the crazy thing too was that at that time, that was what all of the Democrats were saying. You had Joyanne Reid on MSNBC saying, "I don't trust that vaccine." Kamala Harris, everyone, okay, when it was a Trump vaccine.
Right.
And then I just watched in 2021 as everyone's publicly on the media switch sides, and again publicly, and I just thought, I was honestly scared, because my social media feed, people I'm close friends with, were posting things like, "I hope all of the unvaccinated people die." Unvaccinated people are like mountain lions; they just want to kill everyone. These are people I knew, and a lot of people posted, this is a right-wing conspiracy. When I'm like, was I in a different universe for the past few months, where it was the Democrats saying that we shouldn't have vaccine mandates and we shouldn't trust this, and that the FDA jamming this through in 2 months is incredibly suspicious? And so I finally, decided, you know what, I'm just gonna write out my reasoning. I'm just gonna tell my own story, and I'm gonna just put it out there, because I cannot believe that there are not other people like me who aren't, who consider themselves on the left or independent or whatever you want to call it. And I was just hoping for all my friends who assumed that I was, vaccinated, that they would see this and they'd have a second thought, instead of just thinking, "Oh, wow, that like crazy, selfish right-wing bitch, like, who helped me with my homework in high school." I just wanted to change the stereotype on that. And the thing that surprised me the most was some of my closest friends, who live in other states and stuff, texted me and said, "Oh my God, I got the shot because I thought everyone around me would hate me, and I didn't want to get it." I had a ton of friends who told me about menstrual problems. I had a couple of friends who secretly hadn't gotten it and just didn't tell anyone. And that was the most surprising thing to me, because I was ready for a lot of people to get really angry at me. But it really, again, it felt like the Bernie 2016 moment, in that I realized there were so many people who were just in hiding, who actually thought this stuff was all messed up. Mm-hmm. And so for me, once I made that first leap of just in my own social networks, just coming out basically with that, I decided, you know what, I want at least one person on the left to, besides, again, I'm, Russell Brand, just somebody to at least run for office and do this. And, in 2020, I actually voted third party, but I did decide to run as a Democrat, because the Hawaii primary system makes it, you can't even run as a nonpartisan in general unless you go through this complicated primary system anyways. But also because my main point of running, honestly, was just to get on some debate stages with some Democrats and try to just challenge them. It was really funny. I had a Big Island forum where I talked about the Canadian truckers, and someone came up to me. It was so funny. She was so happy about it, and she said she saw her friend's brain explode when I mentioned it. But again, like with Bernie in 2016, I think there's a lot of value in just at least having a platform to say that this is not what people actually think, and you don't need to divide people. This is not a partisan issue. But when was bodily autonomy not, a value of the left? It just drives me nuts. And I'm sorry, I feel like I'm yelling at this point because I just couldn't believe what I was seeing in the world. And so, that was my initial impetus. And I felt like because I'd had experience running congressional campaigns from the back end, I could at least take this short run to the primary and at least get the word out, and meet like-minded people and learn and try to help grow that movement here in Hawaii, where I feel like there are so many people who normally don't trust establishments. We learn in school that Hawaii was illegally overthrown. I think Hawaii is a place where this could be such a bigger and more important part of the conversation, but it hasn't been.
Totally, yeah, I really appreciate that exact reflection. That's how I've felt for the whole time. Like, even though I felt the ire of certain fellow leftists or whatever, I remember, I remember I made a post on Instagram sharing Eric Garcetti did a press conference, and I think very early on in the pandemic, like April or something, that was like, blah, blah, blah. If you see anybody not following the COVID guidelines, make sure you can call this number and report. And our line, I know you all are familiar with the line, but in this case, snitches get rewards. And it was just striking to me because, so I shared it and wrote a little, commentary on how I felt like this is a dangerous, slippery slope to be heading into, even if there is some precaution to be taken for a virus when a government official uses that lingo. And it's just so interesting because, to me, I thought as Democrats and progressives, we were against that kind of police brutality, which is like speaking from the pulpit of the police state, saying snitches get rewards. And I'll never forget, one of a colleague of mine from Los Angeles commented something like, blah, 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 you fucking MAGA idiot. And that just really floored me and opened my eyes, because I was just not even a month into the COVID story, and we were already in this hardcore political divide. And somehow it got sort of, the conversation became, even though Trump declared the pandemic and Trump fast-tracked the vaccine process, there became somehow this idea that the Democrats are and the voters too, not just the people in power, were all crazy and falling in line, and then if you do question it, you must just have switched sides to this other political party, which wasn't true for me. I don't align with the Republican Party or Trump because they spend money for the oligarchs and give them tax breaks and spend lots of money on the military and on war. Anyway, let's see. I had a question in there somewhere. How about now that we're in this moment here now, and you're running for Congress, you're running for a recently vacated seat. Could you speak just a little bit to, if you did get in office, what kinds of, how would you use that place to continue exploring these conversations and trying to reach out to people, and what have you learned that you'd like to focus on, maybe in terms of public health and COVID and anything else that is of prime importance to you politically?
I think, in terms of the way the House is structured, basically the party leadership of whichever party's in power decides, what bills go on to the floor, who gets the committee, leadership positions, all of that. And so if you have a minority viewpoint, I think the most important thing is to make some noise and to support movements outside of politics. I don't think you should just tell people to vote harder, right? You need to actually show up for whether that's a general strike or whatever is going on, and not telling people that voting is the only answer. I think it is important to stay engaged in the political process, because if you just cede that entire area, if there's one thing I've learned from the past 2 years is that things can always get worse, whether I want to hide from politics or not. And so I think that's really important. At the same time, I do believe in go big or go home. Like, honestly, I will run for Speaker of the House if I get in, and I will try to build a coalition with people on the Republican side for whom, agree that these lockdowns for businesses destroyed livelihoods, which I think is the public health emergency. And I think that the left used to agree that poverty is a public health emergency. And I do want to focus on COVID because I think, we already have, San Francisco and New York declaring monkeypox a state of emergency. The next Congress is going to have to decide on future or current declared pandemics. And so that is something I want to focus on, preventing future vaccine mandates to limit emergency powers, which we always see for the federal office making permanent, whether that's 9/11 or COVID, right? And then war, that's the other big thing. If you're in Congress, you're probably going to have to decide whether or not we're bombing a couple more countries. Nancy Pelosi is thinking about going to Taiwan right now. And despite China saying that they will militarily intercept her plane, these are huge. These have huge consequences, and so those are the two things that personally I think I want to focus the most on. And I think both of those are tied to environmental pollution, right? With the U.S. military being the world's #1 polluter, and with there's being the chemical industry basically, and whether that's Monsanto's merger with Bayer, right, or Bayer's acquisition of Monsanto. There's so much connection there that I think is very important to recognize and bring to light that I want to focus on too. And as an overarching structure, right, obviously it's the corruption. We cannot have regulatory bodies indirectly or directly getting funded by corporations. We can't have any elected or appointed official or their families getting to trade stocks. Even the Supreme Court, we see them doing stock trades before their decisions. And we need all appointed and elected officials to have term limits. Fauci, he's like 80, 82? I don't remember. The power, again, I really believe in decentralizing power, and the longer you let someone sit in a seat, the more likely they are to become corrupt. No matter who it is, it's just human nature. So for me, those are a couple of things that I really want to bring to light. And I also, I just think that if, I have a hope, right, that if one person is willing to do it, that some other people will join them. When AOC first got to the House, she started by protesting in front of Nancy Pelosi's office for New Deal, and no one else joined her. And look at where she is now. Nobody's backing up Nina Turner. No one's backing up each other. But if you have, what they call the Overton window, right, of someone making you look bad, for lack of a better word, for actually fighting, then we'll see what happens. But if I was elected, I would hope that there would be that opportunity to build that coalition of people who are on whatever label they want to call themselves. Labels tend to divide us too, but anyone that's for the people and whatever party label they want or nonpartisan, I hope to try to be a voice for all of them.
How do we kind of bridge this kind of gap in our political divide where those that identify on the right rightly don't want to use public dollars for anything. Really, like it seems like when you get into nuts and bolts of, like, for example, public funding of elections versus how much corporate money is involved right now, and it's just turned into this, even in I feel like the individual contribution era has turned it into even more of a, like, it's just like our elections are in its own industry, which I think is what keeps people from like AOC and others from staying consistent in keeping the Overton window out here. What are some ways conversationally, just these are things on my mind, and we can kind of wrap up soon our conversation here, but do you have any thoughts on how to like bring people into that kind of conversation?
For sure. And I've kind of changed my stance on this over the years too, and I do think that currently our tax dollars do more harm than good because, again, like we've talked about, because most of our tax dollars are going to the military industrial complex and the deep state. But I think in that regard too, you know, I've always tried to emphasize that I'm not calling for increased funding. I'm calling for redirected funding. I actually also I do support, I think we could lower payroll taxes for small business. I think we could lower income taxes for low and middle income people and still have more than enough money from the Pentagon budget, right, to fund everything else. Public financing is a particularly tough one. I've even heard people on the left who, you know, who have issues with that, which surprises me. For me, I like to emphasize the issue of people, all else being equal, still being able to personally finance themselves, right? So if you don't have public financing, then who's going to be able to run Larry Ellison, like Mark Zuckerberg? There needs to be a counterpoint to that, I think. It is still, though, I think the most challenging of all of those. And for me, too, it's also just a matter of, you know, just being practical in like the order things happen with. So, you know, I think term limits is something that doesn't cost money, that, you know, if we can even get there first and then take those next steps too, once people establish trust, you know, that everyone's well-intentioned, then I think that's helpful too. I will say though, I've had a lot of like positive conversations with people who consider themselves on the right in terms of, you know, it's hard to tell these days, you know, what anti-establishment means, right? What does big government even mean, right? You were talking about this earlier, right? Do cops count as big government? They're government employees, but if you're on the right, then, you know, this is a stereotype again, you know, the right and the left aren't monoliths, but Blue Lives Matter.
It certainly seems to be that they have identified with a story that excuses the police and military in our big government and big spending. And then thus also it excuses like a lot of the chemical poisonings and things like that keep coming back around. And so I think there's this place that we all can come to, because there's also a lot of people in those groups that are really into the movement of regenerative agriculture and getting our food systems fixed, which became a big focus of mine and ours when I moved home. We joined the Farmers Union, and this will be the last kind of bit here. But so you can see we're growing a lot of stuff in the yard here, and I made some short documentaries with a couple of the local farms, including Kahumana, early on in the pandemic. And I realized that the story about planet health is a story about human health, and soil health, and all these things are really tied in. And you mentioned a little bit earlier about the, you know, big ag and the connections to, well, pharma and military. But do you have any thoughts on just, you know, within office, and then also just as a local citizen, like things we can all do to better participate in a regenerative agriculture future that gives us better food systems as a basis for our health? Because one thing I've heard from people when I question COVID, like, why don't we shut down the world to, you know, stop the poisonings and stop the war if we really care about life and people? And they say, well, why can't we do both? And I'm like, okay, I'm waiting, you know. So like, how can we then invite these Democrats who are hardcore COVID people into well, let's start doing the things to make us more healthy and resilient in all these ways, ecologically and beyond. Do you have any thoughts, stories you'd like to share on that?
Yeah, so I think you're asking kind of like on an individual action level too, what people can do. I think the most basic thing, right, is just to buy from local farmers. And I think it's always a challenge at first to change habits, but once you get used to, you know, going to a farmer's market or developing a delivery relationship with some farmer, that's the first step, right? We can vote with our dollars, as they say. Yeah. I think too, just in all of these issues that can be divisive or confusing to people, I think we just have to think about how do we find common ground with people versus how do we prove that we're right? I think, you know, I have this tendency too, you know, I want to get into comment wars with people in a way that's not productive. Yeah. And I think, you know, even for myself, just talking to farmers and asking them, you know, how we can support them, or what do they want us to know, what do they want us to learn is a really helpful starting point to be able to have those conversations with other people as well. And what, I think just trying to grow your own food for me, I am a plant murderer, and I think it's a helpful experience to just appreciate, that it's challenging work that we undervalue as a society. And so, having that personal experience, I think, is important for anyone.
Cool. Yeah, one thing I learned last thought from me is when our local food budget from a former ag state, our ag budget is now 0.4% of our total state budget, and we are an importer of 99 to 95% of our goods, which keeps us like behind in every single way on the ability to be sort of sustainable and healthy here locally. So I hope those are things we can keep talking about, you and I, maybe, as we have, because this is going to be hopefully both go into our podcast, but also be an ongoing documentary series about health and ecology and all that. So I'd love to pick a conversation back up with you in the future. Do you have anything in finality you'd like to share about anything we've talked about, or about your run, or something that's central to who you are and why you're running, or beyond that?
Sure. I think the one thing I want to say is that I sincerely am open to the idea that I'm wrong about anything. It's really hard, and I totally empathize with having a really hard time separating truth from fiction. I also totally understand people who just don't. It's too stressful. I'd rather just like keep doing what I'm doing. I don't want to learn more. Like I honestly get it. Especially if you're someone who, has 2 jobs or has kids or all these other barriers we have. And so for me, I think coming from that, I hope that this is my campaign pitch that I give people, even if you don't agree with me on all this, at least you can believe that I'm willing to tell you what I actually think. Because I feel like we can't, as a society, make progress if everyone is afraid to tell each other what they actually think. And I think this is part of why the media and polls are always so surprised. Look at Trump. No one saw it coming because you alienated a huge part of the population who didn't feel comfortable having their minds changed by you or listened by you. So, I just hope to bring that to the table.
Nice. Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
This was great. Thank you. Cool.
It was fun.